Okay, a very good evening to you all. Welcome to the guest lecture, Digital Vertigo, How Social Media is Disorientating Us, presented by Andrew Keen, all the way from America. My name is Trinke Drijfhout. I work as a senior lecturer at the Department International Communication, School of Communication, Media and IT, Hanze University of Applied Sciences. I was asked to present Andrew. Our today's speaker is a historian, political scientist who studied in England, Yugoslavia and America. For almost 20 years, Keen has been a digital media entrepreneur and Silicon Valley insider. His popular writings about culture, media and technology has been published in famous newspapers and magazines, including The Guardian and Business Week. In 2007, he published his first book, The Cult of the Amateur, on how today's internet is killing our culture and assaulting our economy. Even the co-founder of Wikipedia, Larry Spenger, admitted that this was a thought-provoking and sobering book which made him think about a lot of internet issues. Keen's book expresses and outlines his concerns about the celebration of amateurs on the internet. Isn't it amazing how anyone with an opinion can post a blog, a video on YouTube, or change an entry on Wikipedia? How do we know who are the real experts and who are the fake ones, the amateurs? To whom do we listen? It seems the survival of the loudest and most opinionated voice counts. The book generated a firestorm of interest and fueled constructive debates about Web 2.0. But Keen must have thought that the battle against Web 2.0 has only just begun. Nowadays, we have Web 3.0. This year, Keen published his book. Well, we have a Dutch version here, De Digitale Afgrond. Digital Vertigo. The English version is not available in the Netherlands. We have only a few, but unfortunately Dutch. But the book is about how today's social revolutions is dividing, diminishing, and disorientating us. Keen is warning us for hell. If we are not careful, we will free fall into the future and end up in a nightmare. The digital vertigo or digital hell, because we give away our individual privacy and liberty. By advertising ourselves on LinkedIn, Facebook and Twitter, we give away our personal data to men like Mark Zuckerberg, founder and owner of Facebook, who has become a multimillionaire because he owns our personal data. And Keen, and that's the last I would say, Keen may be critical about Web 2.0 and 3.0. However, he nevertheless uses digital communication as well. He has his own blog, is on Wikipedia and YouTube, and he introduced his new book online on the TEDx website in Danubia last year. Obviously, Andrew Keen himself is not avoiding the so-called digital hell. I am looking forward to provoking questions and a continuing debate on digital communications here in Groningen this evening. Please prepare, while listening to Andrew Keen, critical questions. We have two students who will prepare critical questions as well and will open up the floor after the presentation of Andrew Keen. So please take over.
Thank you. Well, that was quite an introduction, wasn't it? I don't need any notes. So that's the book, Digital Vertigo, and it's not just disorienting, it's dividing and diminishing us. How many of you feel diminished and divided and disoriented by social media? None of you? Well, maybe I can persuade some of you in this lecture. So before we begin, or as we begin, this is a nice intimate evening. Are most of you from Groningen? Do most of you know one another? No? Well, why don't we start to get to know each other more intimately? Why don't you look at each other? I know, do Dutch people get intimate ever? Sometimes, maybe when the lights go out, right? Maybe we should turn the lights out. Who controls the lights here? So if you don't look at each other, I will turn the lights out. So just give each other, and hopefully most of you are strangers. Look at each other. Go on, don't be shy. This is your excuse. This is your opportunity to stare at the person next to you without any kind of embarrassment. Go on, don't be shy. So what do most of you see? Now, of course, I think what you see is kind of... what you see reflects the world in which we live in. I mean, once upon a time, I was in Belgium last week, and I was in this 15th century town hall in Ghent. And it reminded me that once upon a time, if we'd have been in this room in the 15th century in Ghent or somewhere else in Belgium or Holland, you would have seen symbolic forms. We would have been dressed, perhaps, to reflect our social status, the group, the ethnic group we were from, the ghetto or the community in which we were a part. I think in the pre-modern age, to borrow a kind of a joke, we wore our identities on our sleeves, and our sleeves revealed who we were and who we weren't. Now, in the modern age, it's been very different. Most of us have been brought up in a world in which we value what it is that lies beneath the surface. So you may look at each other and see a face. You may see an ugly face, a good-looking face, female, male, white, black, brown, grey hair, white hair, even blonde hair. We'll talk about blondes later in this conversation. And there are some blondes, I can tell. But what was behind that wouldn't be evident. So when most of you looked at one another, and most of us have a kind of modern industrial sensibility, when you looked at your neighbor, you wouldn't see very much. You would see questions, you would see mystery. You wouldn't know, for example, what books you might guess the kind of books they like, the kind of movies, where they eat their food, where they live, what their networks are. You might guess what their health records are. You might guess their age, I guess you can, to some extent, guess. But most of all, when you looked at a stranger, you would see a mystery. And of course, I think that one of the great miracles in the human condition, what makes us so interesting and what makes living so exciting and worthwhile, is sometimes when you meet a stranger that you know nothing about, you become a friend. Sometimes you become a romantic friend, sometimes a platonic friend. But so much of the wealth of being alive is bound up in getting to know someone, in exploring their mysteries, in understanding their narratives, in learning what they like and what they don't like. That's what friendship is about. That's what love is about. Now, in the 21st century, I think something is changing. There's a company in Silicon Valley, some of you may have heard of, it's called Google. And they, I'm sure everybody here, I hope, if you haven't heard of Google, you probably should leave the room now, because this lecture won't be very valuable to you. But Google have developed something they call Google Glasses. And when you put on Google Glasses, you won't see that physical face. If we were all wearing Google Glasses, and I asked you to put it on, we would see each other as data. We would see each other as information. And this is the brave new world of digital society, maybe Web 3.0, Web 4.0, I'm not sure how many O's we can add to this thing. But this is what most interests me. This is what drove me to write a book called Digital Vertigo, which is about this process of, as we shift from being mysteries, as we shift from being beings of secrecy and question marks, to being data, to being information. And as companies like Google are bringing to market products like Google Glasses, which enable us to see strangers as data and perhaps learn more and more intimate things about one another without ever knowing one another, this is what drove me to write my book. This is what I most fear about what we might call social media or the information revolution or big data or Web 3.0. There are lots of terms for this. Now, what I did was I built, the book is called Digital Vertigo, but it's not a throwaway remark. Sometimes people name books just because they think it sounds cool or cute. But I like the term Digital Vertigo. I think it's an arresting term, but it's not, I didn't use this term simply to arrest you. It was built around my affection and interest in Alfred Hitchcock's great 1958 movie, Vertigo. How many of you have seen that film? Okay, well, you all should see it, because it was just voted the greatest movie of all time by Sight and Sound. By every 10 years, Sight and Sound's an English magazine. They poll, I think, 1,000 of the leading critics in the world, and every 10 years they decide which is the greatest movie ever made. So if you're interested in movies and you only ever see one movie, it should be Vertigo. So there's no excuses. I would rather you watch the movie than read my book. I mean, I'd like you to do both, but you do need to see that film. You have a moral obligation. I don't believe very much in moral obligation, but if there is one moral obligation you have, it's to see Vertigo. For those of you, and I apologize, those of you who haven't seen it, I will to some extent ruin your experience by giving away some of the plot. But the movie is not, as all great movies, the movie has nothing to do with the plot. In fact, the more you know about the plot, the more interesting the film is. So I'm going to start with a little scene from the film. Let me just set it up. I asked you all to look at one another, so I was kind of inviting you to become detectives. And I think this theme, this metaphor of being a detective is very, very important in terms of the book and what we'll talk about tonight. Vertigo is also a film about detectives. It's a film about a detective called Scotty Ferguson. He's acted by Jimmy Stewart, and he's been hired by an old college roommate to follow this man's wife. He's been hired because he's been told by his friend that the woman is seeing ghosts, that she imagines she's actually her 19th century relative. So this is the first, and the scene I'm going to show you, this is the first scene in which Jimmy Stewart sets eyes on the woman. Her name is Madeleine Albright, not Madeleine, that was the Freudian error, Madeleine Elster. And she's acted by Kim Novak. It's her great role. Hitchcock bullied Novak into doing this role. I think after Vertigo she had a nervous breakdown and never acted again. But at least he got one good role out of her. This movie, where Hitchcock was in, there's a famous book in which François Truffaut, the French film director, has a series of conversations with Hitchcock about his movies. And here, Truffaut says to Hitchcock at one point about Vertigo, he said, well, all you did in Vertigo with Jimmy Stewart, all he did was, he didn't act, he looked. In Vertigo, all Jimmy Stewart does is look. And this idea of looking, of course, is central to my critique of social media, and it's also perhaps the sort of the central aesthetic, metaphysic almost, in this movie. So here's the first scene when he sets eyes on her. Look at this. There he is at the bar. This is in a famous old bar in San Francisco called Ernie's. It doesn't exist anymore. A plush steakhouse. Very politically incorrect. Probably why they shut it down. Can you all see? We may need to turn the lights on. It's our excuse. So the music is getting going. Look, it's a blonde. I told you about blondes. Look at that. Thank you. Much better. So look, he's looking, he's looking, he's looking. And the music gives it all away, of course. You can tell he's already half in love. Look at that. And who wouldn't fall in love with a woman like that? So there you have it. There you have the blonde. Now, some of you are probably thinking to yourself, what does this blonde and Alfred Hitchcock's movie Vertigo have to do with social media? It's a good question, of course. The movie is based on a lie. The movie is based on a fundamental deception. The woman who is represented in this film, Madeleine Elster, this blonde, this beautiful blonde San Francisco heiress, isn't really this woman. This woman is actually a brunette, a shop girl from Kansas. And the whole point of the movie is to get Jimmy Stewart to fall in love with something that doesn't really exist, something almost too perfect. Now, we're in the heartland of Dutch Protestantism here, so maybe this won't resonate as much with you as if we were giving this talk in somewhere else in a Catholic country. But Hitchcock, of course, was a Catholic, and it was his warning about original sin and all the rest of the Catholic dogma, the idea of imperfection, and the idea of falling in love with something that doesn't really exist, a warning that we should never believe in perfect things. And that's, I think, what my warning in Digital Vertigo is all about. We're being sold something similar. Blondes who are too beautiful, who are too rich, who are too elusive, don't really exist, of course. At least for me. Maybe some of you have had better luck. And we are, in a manner of speaking, we're being sold a bill of goods, something too beautiful. In Silicon Valley these days, and also in social media circles, we're being told that the internet, this network, which now has 2 billion people, and will have probably 6, 7, 8 billion in 10 years. In other words, everyone in the world, or almost everyone in the world, will be on this network. We're being told that this is a good thing. We're being told that as we shift from an industrial to a digital society, as we have this great transformation, as great a transformation as anything that's really existed in social, economic, political terms since the Industrial Revolution of the middle of the 19th century, we have a great opportunity to come together. So some of these books up there, Generation We, Socialnomics, We Think, Connected, the Hypersocial Organization. Some of you may have read these, some of you may teach it, some of you may even believe in some of this stuff. We're being told that the internet offers us a great opportunity to come together, to realize our social identity. In Marx's excellent 19th century book, The German Ideology, some of you may be familiar with that book, Marx talks about the way in which industrial society will allow human beings to realize what Marx calls his species being. that we can rediscover who we really are as human beings. And a similar argument is being made by many social media theorists, that the social is being rediscovered, reinvented, reborn with the internet, is that we are by nature social beings, but we've never been able to be social beings until we've had this great network, this digital network, that will encompass everyone in the world. Some of the theorists are actually very smart. Some of them I like a great deal. Clay Shirky is a friend, and he's a very brilliant guy. He perhaps is the best example of this, but there are many others as well. Now, my work and my book, and the whole point of Digital Vertigo, is to challenge that argument. To challenge it in two ways, and particularly to argue that we shouldn't be social, that social isn't our natural condition, that social doesn't make us happy, that in many respects what I call the cult of the social is actually diminishing, dividing, and disorienting us. Whatever one thinks about this, whether one is on the side of the social theorists or whether one is sympathetic to what I'm saying, which is a critique of the social and a defense of the individual, there's no doubt that this is an important issue. It's a fundamental issue because the internet isn't a peripheral issue. It's central to our lives. I'm going to show you another clip from another movie. Some of you, probably more of you, would have seen this movie. It's The Social Network. It's the movie about the foundation of Facebook. And I'm going to show you a very short clip in which the fictionalized Sean Parker, who is acted by Justin Timberlake, is simultaneously sniffing some cocaine off a young lady's chest and also telling his friends why the internet is a world historical event. So here goes. So listen carefully to the quote. It's a very short clip.
They check their friends' status updates.
There he is, Sean Parker, the fictional Sean Parker.
Change their photos, and mostly...
Seriously, what happened to music?
We lived on farms, and then we lived in cities, and now we're going to live on the internet.
Sean.
We lived in farms, then we lived in cities, and now we're going to live on the internet. Now, those words were written by the film's screenwriter, Aaron Sorkin, so they're not actually true. Sean Parker didn't actually say that, but he might have said it. And I think it's a very, very profound way of thinking about things. Once upon a time, we did indeed live in villages. Then we lived in cities, so we went, and Marx talked about this, Hegel talked about it, many other historical theorists. We went from feudal to industrial society. In feudal world, we lived in villages. In industrial society, we lived in towns. And now we're going to live on the internet. Now, note that Parker didn't say we're going to live in the internet. One doesn't live in the internet. We're not losing our bodies. We're not literally crawling into a computer screen. That's not possible, at least at the moment, fortunately. Maybe in the future that will happen, or maybe computer screens will crawl into us. But the point about living on the internet means that it's becoming the platform for life. In the Web 2.0 age, there was something called Second Life. And Second Life was a virtual world, and there was a clear difference between the virtual world of Second Life and the real world of this life. But in the world in which it is now evolving, in Web 3.0, there isn't much of a distinction. So when you live on the internet, the virtual and the real become the same thing, or the real is the virtual. The internet then becomes the platform of life. It's how we shape ourselves. It's how we determine our identities. It's how we think about others. It's how we distribute ourselves. It's how we determine our information. It is our information. We become data. So when we live on the internet, we are data. We are information. For those of you interested in this idea of us becoming data, read a wonderful historian of science called James Gleick. He's written a book called The Information, which I think is a very profound book, much more profound than my book in the sense that it's a history of information. And Gleick concludes that we have become information. In the industrial age, of course, we thought of ourselves in physical terms. But in the digital age, we are DNA. We are the data we distribute on the network. And of course, in the digital age, we will see each other, not by looking perhaps at one another in the way that I encouraged you in the beginning of the lecture, but perhaps by wearing glasses. Perhaps we'll have devices implanted in us that will enable us to see each other as data, as information. In other words, perception, the very nature of life, the way in which we see the world and the way in which the world sees us, will be determined by our life on the internet. So this is no marginal change. This is not a footnote. This is the central act in the 21st century. So wherever one stands, you may be against me, you may be for me, you may be in the social camp, you may be in the camp that is very skeptical and suspicious and critical of the social camp. This is an incredibly important issue. Now there's the real Sean Parker. I took that photo myself in Arizona. We were at a conference together. He's quite a character, actually. A very attractive young man, very brilliant young man. He, of course, was the president of Facebook. He was the guy who took Mark Zuckerberg to the original investors, made him a fortune. He was also the founder of Napster. So he's a very, very talented entrepreneur, and he's a visionary. He's one of the smartest people in Silicon Valley. Now, Sean Parker has a new venture. It's called Airtime, and he's doing it with his partner at Napster, Sean Fanning. Now, most of you look old enough to remember Napster. Napster was the product, the file-sharing product, that essentially destroyed the record business or the recorded music industry by enabling anyone to download music without having to pay for it. So, for better or worse, he's had a huge impact. But this new thing he's doing, Airtime, is even more destructive, at least in symbolic terms. With Napster, Parker destroyed the recorded music business. With Airtime, he's kind of destroying the species. Not kind of, just let's say he's not here to defend himself, so we can say I don't think he'd mind. With Airtime, he is destroying the species, or at least he's amongst those who's destroying the species. Now, Airtime is a video network. It may or may not succeed. In fact, its launch wasn't very successful. It may disappear like most Silicon Valley companies, but that doesn't really matter. It's the symbolic element that interests me. It's what he's trying to do. When Sean Parker was interviewed by the New York Times about Airtime, they said, Sean, what are you trying to do with Airtime? He said, we're in the business of eliminating loneliness. Eliminating loneliness. It's what I was trying to do maybe at the beginning by getting each of you to stare at one another. Some of you may be lonely. You may make a friend tonight. It's not just Parker, though, who's in the business of eliminating loneliness. The nature of the social revolution, this new platform, Web 3.0, big data, the information revolution, whatever you want to call it, is also collectively, and I use that word ironically, collectively in the business of eliminating loneliness. Every new web product is designed to be social. It all reflects what I call the cult of the social. I would have called my book Cult of the Social, but my first book was called Cult of the Amateur, so it wouldn't have been very original. Everywhere in Silicon Valley, every new product, every new platform, every new app is by definition social. All these businesses, these enterprises, these applications, they're all in the business of eliminating loneliness. As we go on the network, as the internet, the platform, through mobile, this is post-PC, through our devices, through our iPads, through our tablets, through our intelligent phones, these are all in the business of enabling us to share our data. Now, we all know about Facebook, we all know about Twitter, we all know about LinkedIn. But in every sphere, the internet is going social. New music sites like Spotify are in the business of enabling us to tell the world what we're listening to. We have an explosion of something called social television, in which what we're watching is broadcast to our network. There are social reading sites in which what we're reading will be broadcast to the people we know. There's social food, social travel, social commerce, social location. Social location means that wherever you are, your friends will know where you are, whether you're in a restaurant, whether you're in your car, whether you're on your bicycle, whether you're traveling, whether you're not traveling, whether you're in bed, whether you're, well, you can imagine. It's not just, though, location. Some of it's being drilled down. There are now applications, one called WAS, which will enable drivers to know where other drivers are. There's even a social app for bicycling, which means that we can share where we're bicycling with our network. There are social apps for the past, for the present, for the future. There's even one, which ironically or not so ironically is called Proust, which is about memory, the social memory. There are social intentionality apps where we can tell the world what we want to do, where we will go. It's not just privacy, it's not just what we're up to for fun, it's not just what we're listening or what we're watching or what we're reading or what we're eating, it's where we're working. There are more and more social applications in the enterprise. One is called Yammer. It just sold to Microsoft for $1 billion. So when you put all these companies together, you have hundreds of millions of dollars of investment, of value. We all know about Facebook, the billion people who are members, the 50 or 100 billion valuation, but that's not really the point. Around Facebook, in spite of Facebook, there are hundreds, thousands of social apps, and they're all in the business of doing the same thing, one way or the other, of eliminating loneliness, of sharing our data, of doing away with privacy, of transforming the world into something which is radically transparent, not of turning the lights off, but of switching them on, so that the lights shine on all of us all the time, so everyone knows where we are all the time, so everyone knows what we're thinking all the time. Of course, in a sense, it's like Facebook, but it's Facebook on steroids. Imagine that. Facebook was already Facebook on steroids. Now, Hollywood, some of you may not like Hollywood, but Hollywood understands things better than most and has always understood the future. Hollywood made a movie about this a few years ago. It was called The Truman Show, but it was a fiction. I'm going to show you a little bit of it now, because I think it... Oh, sorry. Before we get to The Truman Show, let's talk about Highlight. Now, I asked you at the beginning of this to look at each other. Any of you on Highlight? Highlight is an app designed to do exactly what I was talking about at the beginning of the lecture. If all of you were on Highlight and you stared at one another, or you wouldn't even have to stare at one another in a room, you could learn about each other. Highlight is what is known as a social location app. Highlight was the darling of South by Southwest this year. Every year there's a new wave of innovation, and every year there's a company that stars. 2 or 3 years ago it was Facebook, a couple of years ago it was Twitter. This year it was Highlight. So Highlight is literally doing what I told you about, which you kind of laughed nervously about. Highlight's in the business, and I'm quoting it, a fun way to learn more about people nearby. What you do on Highlight is Highlight aggregates all your data, your Facebook feeds, your Twitter feeds, everything else that you reveal on the network. And it organizes it and assembles it. And if we're in this room and 2 people are on Highlight, they would be able to access each other's data. It's what the Highlight founder, I interviewed him for my TechCrunch TV show, he described, without any kind of irony, of course Americans don't have irony, he described it as engineering serendipity. Engineering serendipity. That's what Hitchcock was in the business of, but in fictional terms. Hitchcock's engineering of serendipity, of course, resulted in a nightmare, an innocent cop dragged into a dreadful narrative, a nightmarish narrative of murder and suspense. In an odd way, then, we're all becoming like Scotty Ferguson in Vertigo. We're all being embroiled as innocents in this dark world through products like Highlight. But let's talk then, let me just show you this clip from the Truman story.
Bored with watching
Truman Show.
Phony emotions. You're tired of pyrotechnics and special effects. While the world he inhabits is, in some respects, counterfeit.
This is Mark Zuckerberg.
There's nothing
kind
fake about Truman himself.
This is the producer. See, he had his way.
It's a light.
Can you turn up?
I'm not going to make it. You're going to have to go on without me.
So this is a movie about a guy who is imprisoned in a reality TV show. Everyone watches everything he does.
Broken the legs and all.
But he doesn't know
Many
it.
viewers leave him on all night.
He's an innocent.
You're crazy, you know that?
Well, for me, there is no difference between a private life and a public life. My life is my life, is the Truman Show. The Truman Show is
No difference between a public and a private life.
It is a truly blessed life.
It's all true. It's all real. Nothing here is fake. Nothing you see on this show is fake. It's merely controlled.
Now there's a difference, though, between the Truman Show and today's world, the world of Highlight, the world of Facebook, the world of the cult of the social, is that Truman didn't know that he was embroiled in this world. He wasn't revealing himself intentionally. The difference, though, today, I talk about it in my book, is we're living in an age of great exhibitionism. We're all actively knowing what we're doing. We're showing ourselves off. No one's being tricked into doing this. We are all aware of what we're up to. Now, when I was writing my book, I didn't realize that Vertigo would be voted the greatest movie of all time. But afterwards, there was this wonderful quote which seemed to summarize what I was trying to say in my book. The editor of Sight and Sound was asked why he thought that the Vertigo was voted this greatest film. He said, Vertigo is the ultimate critic's film because it's a dream-like film about people who are not sure who they are, but who are busy reconstructing themselves and each other to fit a kind of ideal of the ideal soulmates. Some of you may recognize this if you've been on a dating site. What the internet then is doing is forcing us, I think, to construct ourselves in ways that aren't really social. The internet is turning all of us into celebrities. The internet is not really enabling us, I think, to comfortably broadcast ourselves. All you have to do, go to a Facebook page to understand it. We are losing touch, I think, in this platform of self-broadcast as individuals with who we really are. Most of us aren't comfortable with this because most of us don't really understand what being a celebrity is or building a brand is. Which means that I think more and more of us, when we use this network, ultimately feel a sense of loneliness, of isolation. Because the more we broadcast ourselves, the less social really we are. The more lonely we become, the more isolated, the more caught up in our own cult of personality, our own sense of who we really are. That's one of the reasons why I fear what's happening with social media. We're losing touch with really who we are. We are in the business of advertising ourselves in such a vulgar and childish way that we ourselves as a species are becoming both childish and vulgar. Now, I talk about this in terms of something called digital narcissism. It's not a very original phrase. I put digital before anything, and then, you know. But I think it resonates with many of us. We, of course, are not, we digital people of the 21st century, we're not the first people to be narcissists. The Greeks were the ones who invented the term. And it's always been a condition, I think, that's threatened to corrupt us. It's the blonde inside all of us. It's this idea of falling in love with ourselves and thinking that we are so wonderful that we can tell the world about ourselves. I took this poor woman, I take her all around the world, but I went to the top of the Acropolis in Greece last year. I wasn't thinking about narcissism or even social media. I was going up there to look at the ancient remains of Western civilization. But when I got up there, all I found were people taking photographs of each other and posting them on the network. So even up there, even in the shadow of the Acropolis, we can't lose a sense of ourselves. We are obsessed with showing ourselves off. It's vulgar, it's childish, and I think for the most part we are going to regret it. We're going to regret it because it's shameful and because it leaves a legacy that doesn't credit us as a species. In the very short term, also, it leaves a legacy for our children, for our parents. And most of those legacies that we're leaving are not curated properly, are not very attractive. Beyond that, that's a kind of cultural criticism, which you might think of in some ways as conservative, and you may disagree. But there's another side to the problem with social media. That it's, there's this phrase, again, this is unfortunately isn't my word, visibility is a trap. This was written by Michel Foucault. Some of you may be familiar if you're studying history or if you're interested in psychology. Foucault was the great theorist of the way in which in industrial society we were being perpetually watched. And the scary thing about this digital world is that the watching is continuing. It's being exaggerated. Now, here we have young Mark Zuckerberg, this accidental billionaire, or perhaps not so accidental billionaire, who is in the business, like Jimmy Stewart in Vertigo, of watching. Now, he's not a pervert, he's not Big Brother, he's not watching us because he really wants to know whether we're having an affair or what we're really thinking or whether we're conservative or liberal or whether we're planning to blow up the World Trade Center. The reason why Mark Zuckerberg is watching us, and the reason why Mark Zuckerberg's company and the thousands of other social media companies are watching us, is because their business model depends on it. Mark Zuckerberg's product is free. When you use Facebook, you don't have to pay for it. It's a wonderful product. I'm not on it, but I have been on it, and I understand its attraction. Twitter is free. LinkedIn is free. All the social apps I showed you are free. It's almost too good to be true, isn't it? It's like that blonde, that beautiful woman in San Francisco who drives around the city in a green Jaguar and lets strange policemen kiss her. But of course, like the blonde, it's not really true. It's too good to be true. Because that free model isn't really free. Nothing is ever really free. You Dutch, it's one thing you guys know more than anything, right? Dutch are the experts at seeing through illusion, particularly economic illusion. The reality, of course, of Facebook is that there is an exchange going on. But it's an exchange which some people aren't aware of. Mark Zuckerberg has built us a wonderful product, a wonderful platform, which we can network, which we can show ourselves off. But there's a catch. What the catch is that we give Mark Zuckerberg all our data. We tell Mark Zuckerberg what we like. We tell Mark Zuckerberg who our friends are. We tell Mark Zuckerberg where we live. We tell Mark Zuckerberg whether we're single or married. We tell Mark Zuckerberg whether or not we're gay. We tell Mark Zuckerberg what kind of clothes we like. We tell Mark Zuckerberg almost everything. Now, Julian Assange, the founder of WikiLeaks, said, I don't always agree with what Assange says, but this one was, I think he was right. He said, Facebook could have been invented by the CIA. CIA, unfortunately, are busy with other things at the moment, watching other kinds of things. But it could have been, but it wasn't, because the CIA, as I said, they're old men interested in younger women. They're much too busy with trivial pursuits to be worrying about something so important as acquiring all of our data. Facebook, of course, and it's not just Facebook, but Facebook exemplifies this. We could include Google Plus as well. Facebook is in the business of acquiring our data. Facebook knows us intimately, and that's its economic value. That's why it was valued, still valued. I mean, some people say its stock market price has collapsed. I mean, it depends how you define collapse. I still wouldn't mind having a 4 or 5-year-old company that's worth $50 billion. I still wouldn't mind having a company with, you know, that's only been around half a decade, that has 1 billion members. And the economic model is acquiring our data so it can really sell that data to advertisers. Because advertisers want to know us. Advertisers, the more advertisers know about us, the more attractive we become. It may not be any coincidence then that when you go on Facebook, the advertising you see seems to reflect what you like. Sometimes people scratch their heads and say, I wonder why. Is that engineering serendipity? No, it isn't. In the same way as where if you use Google Plus or if you use Gmail, how many of you use Gmail? And how many of you know that Gmail, why is Gmail free? How does Google make money out of Gmail? Because Google acquires our data. And Google combines the data with the way in which we use search, the way we use YouTube, the way we use their other suite of products to sell our data. Visibility then is a trap. It's a trap for all of us. We're giving ourselves away. We're all becoming Truman Burbanks. We're all revealing everything about ourselves. We're destroying our privacy whether we like it or not. Now, some people in Silicon Valley think that's a good thing. They've written off privacy. It's like the horse and cart. It's like gaslighting, they say. It's just something that goes away. But when it goes away, in my view, we also lose something elemental, essential to what it means to be human. We lose our inner selves. We lose what it means to be truly individual. We lose the mystery and the secrecy of the human condition. Visibility is a trap on many levels in social media. It's not just Zuckerberg, it's health insurance companies. It's every other kind of agency that are using the social web to spy on us. What happens when you put that photo of yourself smoking or drinking or doing something else rather naughty online? Are you going to be surprised when your healthcare provider jacks up your rates or rejects you? Are you going to be concerned when they stop covering you because you said they lied on the form? And this covers every aspect of life. By being so public, by literally enabling Google glasses, at least in a metaphorical sense, to see everything about us, we are making ourselves intensely vulnerable. In a political sense, of course, it's obvious, self-evident. I don't so much fear Big Brother, although if I lived in North Korea or Russia or China, I might. But even in the West, with our paranoia about terrorism and the excuses governments use all the time, whether or not they're elected to watch us, social media is deeply dangerous. That light that is switched on does none of us any good. And it doesn't do government any good. It makes government greedy. Look what's happening in America with this CIA thing. Look at the way in which people's inner lives, I mean, we can make jokes about these CIA guys and these military officers, but they're no different from us. Hitchcock understood that we were all fallible, that we were all, when you scratch the surface, a little bit perverted, a little bit naughty. We all have something to hide. And this world where the light's switched on all the time means that what we have to hide will be unveiled one way or the other. Pretty scary. What's interesting, though, and this is what my book really focuses on, is that this has happened before. This photo is of Jeremy Bentham, the English utilitarian philosopher, who invented something at the end of the 18th, beginning of 19th century called the Panopticon, a building, a physical building in which you could be watched all the time. He invented this whilst he was doing some consulting for Catherine the Great, the enlightened despot in Russia. And Bentham's ideal of being watched all the time, he justified because he said it makes us more efficient, makes us better workers. It will mean we'll be better educated, we'll be better students, we may even be better patients in hospitals. And it's this idea, I think, of being watched, of being more efficient, that's particularly scary in our own age. Because many of the supposed utopians of Silicon Valley are, like Bentham, utilitarians. They see us, Bentham invented utilitarianism, was a way of thinking about human beings which represented us as aggregations of pleasure and pain. So we were kind of analog calculating machines. And of course what Zuckerberg has done is essentially digitalized that. So we need to go back to the 19th century and understand the debates that were taking place, because of course the industrial age also created a network, and much of that network was corrupted. We know the history of communism and fascism and the way in which show trials and visibility destroyed the lives of others. It's important also, and I deal with this in some detail in my book, is to understand the antidote to Bentham and utilitarianism. And in my book, I really focus on a wonderful 19th century book called On Liberty. It was written by John Stuart Mill, who started life, he was the godson of Bentham, and he started life as an acolyte, a utilitarian, and he turned against Bentham because he recognized that we weren't calculating machines. And in On Liberty, he argues that civilization is driven by individuals who are able to stand apart from the crowd. Because what Mill most feared about the analog network, the industrial mass society that was coming into being, was the way in which it created conformity, a crowd mob mentality. And of course, exactly the same is happening today. What's happening in the social web is that there is no dark space, there's no place to hide. There's no way of getting away from public opinion, from the mob, from the collective. Earlier this week, I was in Brussels, and I was speaking at an event called TEDx, and I was honored or fortunate enough to be speaking just after a guy called Steve Wozniak. Now, I hope all of you know who he was. He was the guy who invented the personal computer. He was the brains behind Steve Jobs. He was Steve Jobs' partner right at the beginning of Apple. And what Wozniak did was invent the personal computer, not by going online and chatting and collaborating and sharing his views with others. Wozniak invented the personal computer by sitting in a room at night and thinking it out for himself, apart from the collective, apart from the crowd. There's an excellent new book by Susan Cain called Quiet, another American writer, in which she defends the role of introverts in the world in terms of creativity, of those people who are uncomfortable and shy and stand apart from the crowd, who aren't social. And she has a whole chapter dedicated to Wozniak. So in my speech earlier this week, I actually spoke for a few minutes about him and about his achievement, and about the fact in the social web, when everything's so visible, when everything is about collaboration and sharing, it will be harder and harder for future Wozniaks to invent something as important, as innovative, as revolutionary as the personal computer. And Wozniak afterwards was very complimentary. He said, "You're right." Which I thought he would say I was wrong, but what do I know? So this is what might happen. This is the end of Vertigo, or kind of the end. The corpse. Hitchcock specialized in corpses and things falling down from erect towers. He was a bit of an old pervert. So are we going to become corpses? Is this the end? Am I closing the book of mankind, saying it's all over, we've ruined ourselves, technology has finished everything? No, I don't think so. I think we're still at a moment where we can save ourselves. So let me just very briefly talk about 2 or 3 things which I think can change, which can solve this problem. The first is that we need to be more responsible. The second is that we need to use government. We need to rely on government to help challenge social media companies. So I'm very sympathetic to say the work of Viviane Reding at the EU, who is trying to develop legislation built on the right to be forgotten. We need to teach the internet how to forget. That's its biggest problem. As Sean Parker said, we are living on the network, but it's an inhuman network. If you can't forget, you're not human, because the beauty of being human is the ability to forget, the beauty to invent and reinvent oneself. And the internet at the moment hasn't learned how to forget. We need to invest in companies that focus on privacy, that reject Facebook's free model, that force people to actually pay for products which will guarantee their defense of privacy, that won't sell their data, that won't reveal everything about ourselves. So there are solutions, there are technological solutions. The University of Eindhoven is developing technology that will enable the degeneration of data. We're at the very early stages of this revolution. What we all need is not so much media literacy, but data literacy. The purpose of my book is to create a more data-literate world, a data-literate society, where we begin to understand more and more that the data we throw out about ourselves on the network is used against us, that we are all, in that sense, Jimmy Stewart. So I'm going to end very briefly with the last scene in the Truman story. The guy suddenly understands that he's been living on a movie set, that his life is being broadcast 24 hours a day to a world obsessed with watching him. Watching, surveillance, vertigo. And this is how the movie ends. He's come to the end of the virtual world, or the artificial world, if you like. The world of being watched. This is his opportunity to escape that. So it's a Hollywood ending, very uplifting. Not like Hitchcock, which always ends in falling corpses. I don't think there are any Catholics in Hollywood. See, look at this now. So he's going to go up. So where's he going to go? How's he going to escape? He's learning to walk up. Again, Hitchcock, the stairs always go down. And they're twisting, spiral. This is a straight stairs, upwards. There's the exit. There's Mark Zuckerberg. He's made his billions. He doesn't care anymore. So where's he going to go? So that's the dark space. I can't tell you what's in that dark space. That dark space is different for all of us. For Steve Wozniak, it was the place he went to invent the personal computer. For some of you, it's a place of secrecy and silence. For some of you, it's a place of contemplation. But for all of us, it's that place where we build ourselves, where we become real individuals, where we determine our identity, where we become human. Without that dark space in the digital world in which we all live, I fear we may not end up like Hitchcock corpses. Those are too literal and too silly. But something very profound will be lost. And let's not end on Hollywood, because that's too saccharine. Let's end locally, up the road in Amsterdam. And this is where I end in my book. Everything always ends in Holland. This is a painting by, some of you may be familiar with this, I hope all of you are. This is a painting by Johannes Vermeer, Woman in Blue. It's in the Rijksmuseum. It's one of his great masterpieces, and I don't think it's any coincidence. It's one of the reasons, perhaps, that I do a lot of work in Holland, and my books do well in Holland, and people are interested in my work in Holland, is because Holland was the birthplace of modern individualism. Holland has always been a culture which protects and preserves the right of the individual to be alone, to be solitary. It doesn't mean you're necessarily antisocial. And in this work, I think, more than any other work, Vermeer represents the mystery, the secrecy of the individual. This is a painting of a woman who we don't know, who is remarkably compelling because we don't know her. It's a painting with many symbols and suggestions. But it's a painting that remains a masterpiece, one of the great masterpieces in Dutch art and indeed in all of Western art, because of the way in which it dignifies the human condition. It's a painting which represents us as question marks, as mysteries. It's a painting that more than anything else celebrates secrecy. In our Facebook age, in an age in which we seem to be relentlessly marching away from privacy, where we are fetishizing the public, and radical transparency and connectivity and collaboration. I don't think it would do any of us any harm to go to the Rijksmuseum for an afternoon and look at the Woman in Blue. And the best thing about the Rijksmuseum is you're not allowed to take your computers in. You're not even allowed smartphones. You'll have to look at the thing. You won't be able to tweet it. You won't be able to tell your friends on Facebook. You just have to look at the Woman in Blue and think about what it means to be human. Thank you.
So I think we liked it, Andrew.
Well, don't speak on behalf of everyone else.
I first would like to open up the floor for Raif. Please introduce yourself and raise your questions.
Hello, everyone. I'm Raif Nasser from the Hanze University, studying international communications, second year and part of the honors program. I have a couple of questions, but I'm not going to ask all of them. I think the ones that interest me most are going to be asked. One of them is, I'm going to begin with a question that is more related to our study, which is like the whole advertising world and the whole global world coming together. Before I go to the advertising world, I want to begin with globalization, the idea of globalization and cultural values that are shared through nowadays social media. The question is that we humans have always had prejudices and stereotypes about the rest of the world, but the social media phenomena in general has made us able to distinguish and also able to tolerate other cultures. So seeing social media as from only one side and not taking the cultural value behind it and the openness it creates towards the rest of the world, and thus creating a better economy and a better future for the world, how do you respond to that? How do you see that part of social media? Thank you.
Do you want me to respond now, or you ask all your questions? Oh, okay. So I should go back up. Mm-hmm. I thought I didn't have to do anything else. Well, of course, that's a fair point. Look, let me make one thing clear. The book itself is not quite as one-sided as my first book. I mean, I'm not suggesting that social media is intrinsically evil. I don't say that you shouldn't be allowed to use it. I don't say that, grandmothers shouldn't be allowed to communicate with their grandchildren, or that friends shouldn't be able to reconnect. I mean, some of those things are valuable. And I think your point is, in some ways, it's fair. In some ways, it does enable us to broaden our minds. But I think the internet has been deeply disappointing in that sense as well. Marshall McLuhan famously said that, the network would be the global village. But I think there's an irony to that, because, of course, the village the original village, the place we lived in before we came to the city, was a place of deep suspicion and parochialism, where all we knew was our little community, and we were deeply suspicious of the outside world. And then we got to the city, which was much more open, much more tolerant, which enabled a degree of anonymity. I fear, actually, with the internet, we're going back to the village, because the internet is increasingly a place of echo chambers. Politically, for example, there's an excellent book called The Filter Bubble by an American writer called Eli Pariso, who had believed very much in the internet and then became very skeptical, because he sees the way in which the internet is an echo chamber. We only go to websites that conform to our version of the world. You can't necessarily blame the internet for that. It's also true of television and much of media. But most websites are preaching to the converted. How many of you have ever been on a Korean social network? How many of you have really made friends with people from the Middle East or from Africa? Most of us congregate to what we already know. So what I would say is that the internet does, in many ways, I think, promote more insularity and parochialism, more of a closed-minded view of the world than the kind of globalism that you're talking about. Although I do want to make it clear that I don't think we can blame the internet for that. There are deeper, more complex social and cultural reasons for it. I think, unfortunately, the internet does very much peddle in stereotypes and also lends itself to more and more mob-like political movements. I mean, imagine if the internet had been around in the 1930s. And think of it today. Think of the way in which right-wing groups are using the internet to peddle hatred. So the internet is a reflection of who we are. And in a world of mass unemployment and unhappiness and bitterness and class conflict, I fear the internet could actually exaggerate the kind of movements of rage which are emerging. So.
Hi, I am Manon de Vries, student artificial intelligence and specializing in cybercrime. In the book you talk a lot about the immensity of social media, how fast it is growing, and how many people engage in social activities. But it is written in 2011. Recently, we've seen the bankruptcy of Zynga, near bankruptcy. We've seen the massive downfall in the stock market of Facebook. How do you explain that?
I think that's a fair criticism. I think one of the weaknesses in the book, and you get very close to these things, is that one, in a sense, I wouldn't say I bought into the hype, but companies, and a better example is Groupon, Zynga. In my book, I write about their massive value and their massive popularity. And in some senses, I think it would be fair to say that some elements of social media have been a bubble. And I think that's a fair criticism. Although what I would say is there is, again, a more profound structural change in the nature of the internet. It's becoming, by definition, more collaborative. And that, sharing and collaboration and the social have acquired a kind of ideological fervor. So beyond the popping of the bubble, whether or not it's Facebook or Zynga or Groupon, things like social commerce, social networking, social gaming, these are profound realities which go beyond individual companies. But it's a fair point, and it's something that's slightly embarrassing for me because, and the whole book wasn't built on this, but, a few pages I write about Zynga and Groupon, and now they're not quite valued at what they were. So it's a warning for any of you who write books about the internet. Don't believe the hype.
Okay, I have another question, which is more related to the advertising part. Like you said at some point, or you insinuated at some point, or mentioned that advertising, is getting too personal to a certain extent, and even some companies might cancel your subscription because of some action you took. But did you look at the other side of it? Since the dawn of human beings, we have been trying always to get our lives easier and easier and easier, so that we go through our lives without any troubles and without any, just tiredness, so to speak. Point is that if advertising gets more personal and personalized towards one human being, wouldn't a person rather have a product that fits his personality on a complete level than to go from store to store to get, for example, whatever he wants? Isn't it easier for humans to go towards a point where we just get the products like we want them and not to search for them, because it saves us time and energy?
Well, that's a great question. A few years ago, Eric Schmidt, who was at that point the CEO of Google, now he's just the chairman, he was asked by the Financial Times, I think it was in about 2007, so it's he said, Eric, where do you want Google to be in 5 years? He said, Google in 5 years I'd like Google in 5 years to know us better than we know ourselves, and know what we're going to do when we get up in the morning. And that's what this data revolution is about. Google wants to know us better than ourselves. It wants to serve up what it thinks we want. It wants to essentially aggregate that data in more and more sophisticated ways. And of course what Google has is an algorithm, artificial intelligence, which, in my mind at least, is a nightmarish scenario, which knows all of us better than we know ourselves. So that it will know at 11 o'clock in the morning that we drink orange juice, or have a cup of tea, or have a nap, or want a croissant. Google's even inventing the self-driving car, not because it wants to benefit mankind, but because it wants to acquire our data. Because when we sit in Google's self-driving car, it will record everything we're doing. This is a really, really serious question. So the question was a very interesting and intelligent one. Do we want to live that kind of life? Do you want to be in a world where machines know us better than ourselves? Where machines will know exactly what we want, when we want it? Is that engineering serendipity? So my response to that would be that that's a nightmare. That is a world which will literally undermine who we are as a species. It does away with our free will. It means we never think for ourselves. Because the beauty of advertising, in a general way, is we never quite, there's the famous joke about the truck, that you can see an advertisement for a Ford truck 1 million times, but it's never going to make you buy a truck. But I don't think that's true, because all of us have a truck inside us. All of us are capable of doing something or other at a certain point in our lives. We never quite know when that's going to happen. So I want to preserve serendipity, and I think that the scenario you imagine is one that does away with something which is elemental to who we are as human beings.
Is there somebody who would like to react now on what Andrew is saying? Yeah? Oops. Yeah. Because I've seen you writing during the presentation, and I would like to give you a chance to respond.
Hello. I was wondering, because you said Google, the CEO said that Google would like to know you better than you know yourself. What do you mean with better? Because you know yourself, you're going to have an orange juice at 11 o'clock and you're going to drive to pick up groceries, I don't know what. But what do you mean with better? Because you know it yourself.
Well, what he meant was that we are not as conscious of what we want, perhaps, as he'd like us to be. So the better he knows us, the more he's able to serve up advertising that suits us. So essentially these machines are, or machine the algorithm, which is a machine. In his, it's not, those aren't my words, those are his words. And that's the great ambition of Google, artificial intelligence. It's not just Schmidt, it's the other founders, Page and Brin as well. They're all in the business of creating artificial intelligence, which will somehow go beyond our abilities in terms of thinking. It's also bound up, I think, in increasing more and more artificial intelligence in the workplace, as I said, in cars. So we might think to ourselves, well, no one can know us better than ourselves. And some of you may believe that, but clearly the Google people don't.
Can I react on that? Isn't there a counter movement going on just at the moment? I noticed that first Firefox, but now Chrome have ad blockers. So all those personal advertisements are never shown.
Yeah. Well, that's a good point, and that's something I didn't add actually in my what is to be done. Microsoft has even created a default do not track in their IE10 browser. I don't think Google generally wants to block stuff because Google's business model is based on acquiring our data, the same as Facebook. But I think a company like Microsoft, which for better or worse, the business model is not based on that, is actually more supportive. There's also a new search engine called DuckDuckGo, which is again an anti-Google search engine, which is based on blocking personal data. So you're absolutely right. I mean, it's silly to get involved in a for or against Google argument. This is more a debate about what the digital economy of the future should look like and what the role of our personal data should be in it.
Yeah, okay, yeah, here in front. Yeah?
Do you need a microphone or?
Well, if you speak that loud.
I'll speak louder.
Yeah, speak up.
Thank you for your wonderful presentation and thank you for your breathtaking and inspiring book, Andrew. However, I would like to take a radical stance with you. You mentioned John Mill as giving a good answer to the utilitarianism created by Bentham. But I would like to introduce you, maybe you know, to Friedrich Schiller, you know, the German philosopher, who had a different point of view of reacting to industrialism than John Stuart Mill. He said we should not resort to individualism, as you plead for, but he said we should embrace playfulness. And I think that's exactly what we're doing right now. What social media gives us is an area of play where we can experiment, where we can switch identities, where we can fool ourselves. So the main element of your book is that we're losing this mystery, we're losing this inner space. It's totally untrue, as I see it, because there are lots of new mystery created by these new media. For example, I've seen, while introduced, I had to look around, right? You asked us to look around, and now I think, wow, what would a Facebook profile look like?
Keep your question short.
What would be on Facebook?
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. I think the big issue of the future, the opportunity, the great issue of the future, the great opportunity is what I would call the curation of the self. So the question said, it offers an opportunity to allow social media, to arrive digital platform, to become the place where we invent, continually, playfully, creatively invent and reinvent ourselves. And you're absolutely right. Some people are doing that, and there's the research of a woman called Dana Boyd at Microsoft who says more and more young people are doing that. That's the challenge, is that this media does offer an opportunity for us to curate ourselves in a very playful, funny way. I think most of all what we need to do is lie. What we need to learn to do on social media is lie. The worst thing about it is its confessional nature. And the other troubling thing about it is its lack of anonymity. I wrote the first book against anonymity called Cult of the Amateur, which I said it creates a great deal of incivility. I didn't realize that there's only one thing worse than anonymity, which is its complete absence, which Facebook's trying to destroy. So I think your point's a very fair one. That's the great opportunity and danger. If we can all learn to curate ourselves in a funny, human way, then we'll create a new renaissance. If we don't, then it will be the reverse.
Why do you think we don't? I mean, aren't you at the bottom just
Please use a microphone. We can hear it in the back.
Well, when was the last time you went on Facebook? Yeah. When was the last time you went on Facebook?
In my car, while driving home from Brussels.
Yeah, I mean, or Twitter. I mean, I think a lot of what you find on these networks is incredibly inane. It's not funny. It's not creative. But of course, you can also point to stuff which is creative. And the opportunity, I think, for particularly people coming onto these networks now is to use them in a very human way, and I hope they will. But at the moment, I'm not sure how much evidence there is.
Yeah, there is a lady on the left. Please take first the microphone so all can enjoy your question or remark, but try to keep it short.
Thank you so much for your very interesting talk. I was just thinking, I'm sure that, of course, you've spent time observing kind of the sociality of physical spaces, and I've observed in the past 3 years, especially changes with my students, the way they interact with each other, but also the kind of distracted ability to pay attention to a lecture, which can be quite frustrating. But even, I have a funny anecdote. I was sitting in a park with a friend. 2 very beautiful young women walked by, and there were 2 young college guys who were kind of talking through their phones to each other, and these gorgeous women walked by, and neither one of the 2 guys noticed these absolutely fabulously looking...
Were they blonde?
Yeah, they were both blonde, of course.
See, I was lucky they didn't.
Even I noticed them. But I'm wondering if you thought about, just the kind of interaction with physical spaces, traditional norms of sociality.
Yeah, well, that's... I mean, I don't really get... A lot of books have been written about that, but certainly, yeah, the way... I mean, what really drove me to write the book is that I saw 2 things happening simultaneously. The cult of the social on the internet, on the network, but the fact that we're struggling more and more, all of us, to make real human connections. There's an excellent book about this called Alone Together by an MIT psychologist called Sherry Turkle. She does a huge amount of research, and what she finds was that the more people who use social media, and the classic example is in Japan, where people sit next to each other and text each other without talking to one another, the more alone we feel. So I think there's definitely that kind of tendency, which is, of course, very troubling, but it's part of this irony of social media. Social media is, in reality, reflecting a more and more individualized, atomized, fragmented, lonely world. Very few people are actually very social on social media. Social media just becomes an extension of the self. And we can click and unclick communities. We use it more and more to reflect what we think as individuals rather than in any kind of social sense.
I don't know how many of you have a Facebook account. Can I ask that? Could you raise your hand? Is that true, what Andrew is saying? This about self-exposure and a fragmented life? Do you agree or do you disagree? Who takes the stand? You. You agree. Who's more? Who agrees? Yeah. That's an interesting one.
Can I just give you my own Facebook stories? I used to be on it, and I got off it because I had to maintain some degree of credibility if I'm going to write a book against social media. But also, it really pissed... One thing I used to hate so much about Facebook was, I got a lot of 2 things. Firstly, I got some real friends on Facebook. Of course, most of the people on Facebook weren't my real friends. They were just people who invited me on. And whenever I would go onto it, I would only ever hear about people I didn't care about, and they were always annoying. But the other thing that I really didn't like, and this sometimes was even with friends of mine, is how people would post photos of their children. And what people have failed to understand, this is one of the great sort of cultural revolutions that's taking place. When I grew up, I knew nothing about my parents. And my parents didn't plaster the world with my photograph. This is going to dramatically change the dynamic of relationships between parents and children, how families think of oneself, how we think of our legacies. It comes back to the excellent question about the curation of the self. And I think what really troubles me is the way in which parents slap up these photos of their infants and young kids without understanding that these kids will grow up, that they will resent it, and that we need to be much more careful about asking other people's permission before plastering the network with their images.
Rajev, I think or you want to react or you have one final burning question, I think. Yeah? Yeah, because you compared so well.
Yeah, this I left this one for last because I've been thinking about this in the past couple of days. Is the loneliness factor. When you say loneliness, you don't distinguish really between loneliness and being alone. You say you need the time in the dark. You need the time in the dark to be creative. But you make it seem that if you don't take the time in the dark, that means that you're lonely. The time in the dark in itself is not loneliness, it's being alone, and that is your choice. Loneliness is not a choice. Loneliness is just comes upon you. And if you can delete that, there is where I actually a little bit believe what they say by eliminating loneliness, is the fact that if you go on Facebook, it is your choice. You try to interact with people, and Facebook doesn't force you in any way to stay there and delete your creativity. Your creativity is yours, and being alone is your choice. You can just stand up, go, be alone, and do your thing. So the question here is more about like how do you make loneliness out of sitting on Facebook? I think that a lot of people have actually Facebook to make them feel less lonely, which a lot of people are convinced of. So how do you explain that? How do you tell those people that actually they're getting more lonely instead of, not being lonely?
Well, there's two parts to the question. The first part's one I often hear. It's an interesting question. People say, well, why are you bothering to criticize Facebook? You don't have to be on it if you don't want to be. If you don't want to be on it, just don't be on it. Just leave it. Stop worrying about everything. What's interesting, though, is I'm not sure if we really have much of a choice anymore. Because as we live more and more on the internet, these networks aren't just, I've got my cultural criticism about narcissism, but there's something else going on which is in some ways more important. You have a structural shift in the economy from an industrial economy to a knowledge economy, from economies in which we work for large firms to economies in which we work for ourselves, and which we're continually inventing and reinventing ourselves and selling ourselves. And these are the platforms of 21st century life. If you're not on Facebook, you don't really exist. Let me tell you one anecdote which kind of reflects that. There is we're emerging in what's called the reputation economy, in which our reputation is the new currency. Reputation is the new oil. And our value will be determined by reputation. There are even reputation networks like Clout, which give a score to how much value, to how valuable our reputation is. And it's not just symbolic. Cathay Pacific in San Francisco Airport now have a policy where if you have a Clout score above 60, you get into their first-class lounge. Now, it's a clever advertising strategy, but a world of clout and of reputation, that's the future. It's unavoidable. Only the very, very rich and the very poor will be able to afford not to be on these networks. And your second part of the question is an important and interesting one. And let me just summarize it very simply. I believe that societies that have strong individuals create worlds with strong individuals create strong societies. So the individual of Mill, the thoughtful individual, collectively create strong societies. Mill wasn't a libertarian or an anarchist. He wasn't against the collective. But what we have today is the worst of both worlds. We have fragmented, what one sociologist called intraviduals, individuals who have no sense of the self, fetishizing the social. What we have today are weak individuals and the weak social. So I'm not against the social, but I'm against the kind of social ideology that's been fetishized by Silicon Valley.
Okay, thank you. And then it's almost 9 o'clock, but there's one man with blonde hair who really would like to ask, to pose a question. That's good for your.
We can't find a woman with blonde hair.
Yeah.
Are any blondes here? No.
Yeah, but also men. And this is the final question. Just I would say, make it a good one.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Okay.
No pressure.
My name is Michael. I'm with the Pirate Party. And I would like to ask you said that you would like to get government involved in curbing these companies to invade our privacy so much. And obviously I agree with you about curbing the privacy invasion. But what if the government, and most governments do this, want to invade your privacy themselves? We have data retention, we have surveillance cameras everywhere. What do you do if your government does that? How do you get government to stop Facebook?
For instance, in China.
That's a good question. Well, even in the West, well, we have the Pirate Party for that, right? No, it's a fair question. And I'm not trying to defend government in the sense that the government has... I think many governments are trying to take advantage and are sort of turning the world into a Hitchcock movie where we're being spied on all the time. But I would also warn about fearing government too much. I think the 20th century was the age of Big Brother, where you had a single ideology, a single state, which was monstrous. I think in the 21st century, Big Brother has fragmented into billions of little brothers. So as much as fearing Stalin or Hitler or George Bush, perhaps more than anything else, we should be fearing each other. So I'm not in the Pirate Party. I'm not as skeptical of as the Pirate Party of government. I think there is a role for government. I think if we don't rely on government, we're in deep trouble because we can only rely on each other, and we know what each other are doing. We're watching each other. So that's my response.
Okay, well, Andrew, it is such a pity because we are here with 130 people perhaps, and I've seen so many people looking at me like, Trinke, I would like to raise questions, and you did not have the chance. But you do have a chance to thank Andrew, to buy his book. He will be around, he will be signing.
And ask questions then, yeah.
Okay, and Andrew, thank you so much for your spicy remarks. I think you gave us so much extra knowledge, and you made us so much aware about if we will start up our Facebook, we will think about what you have said. Thank you.